My book, The Package King, is really kind of a history of the United Parcel Service and its relationship to the Teamsters Union, with some ideas about what the future of both the logistics industry and what the American labor movement needs to do to organize it over the next, I would say, decade, if not longer. I wanted to start off by saying that UPS, for people who don't know, is the largest unionized private sector employer in the country, with over 250,000 members in one union, which is the Teamsters, overwhelmingly the Teamsters. There are other unions that represent UPS workers. The pilots are members of the Independent Pilots Association. There are some machinist locals that represent the mechanics and others. But it's overwhelmingly, the workforce is overwhelmingly represented by the Teamsters Union across the country. UPS is not only the largest private sector unionized employer, it is in the top 10 of the largest employers in the United States, period, in the United States, and depending on what time of year it is, because there's a large seasonal workforce that's hired, it's either number 5 or number 7 in the top 10. Globally, it employs over 440,000 workers around the world. The largest grouping is in North America. The second largest grouping is in Germany and in Europe. But 440,000 employees, just to give people the scale and size of the company and its workforce, is actually larger than the standing army of the United States, which is only 400,000. So to give you some sense of what UPS represents as a unionized workforce, as a workforce in the United States, as a global workforce, I think those are important numbers. And it's likely that that number will increase over the next few years, not decrease at all. That also, I think, tells you something about the change in the nature of the industrial economy over the last, say, 25 years. The largest industrial corporation, unionized corporation, employer in the United States, up until very recently, was, of course, General Motors, which at one time represented 300,000 members of the United Auto Workers. That place has now been replaced by United Parcel Service. So this gives you some sense of its importance, not only as a corporation. On a daily basis, for example, it moves about 6% of the United States GDP, and the global GDP of about 2% each day around the world. And FedEx represents an equal number of amount of GDP it moves. So I'm trying to give you a sense of not only what these corporations, or UPS in particular, represent, but what they represent in terms of a workforce, the unionized workforce, but also something that is unique because most of the logistics industry that we talk about is actually non-union. And so the future of both the Teamsters, unionized workers, really depends on whether UPS becomes a place to organize the unorganized, or it becomes more of a precariously situated industrial union. I want to maybe give people 3 recent examples. There's many more than this. 3 recent examples of what it's like to actually work at UPS and be a member of the Teamsters Union. I'll give you one example on March 1st of this year in Riviera, Florida, which is a very small city, mostly African American city north of Miami, north of Miami Beach. There's a small UPS hub there. The Teamsters local, represented by Mike Scott, is local 769. You probably have never heard of it. There's lots of little Teamster locals across the country. But they actually called a picket of their workers on a Tuesday morning against racist harassment of their part-time loaders on the job. This is the first time I know of in at least many decades, maybe ever, where a Teamster union actually called a picket outside of a UPS facility against racism. In April of this year, 8 men, 8 all African American, some former, some current employees of the UPS, won a civil suit against UPS for $5.3 million in Lexington, Kentucky, charging that the company had created a hostile work environment, particularly because of its racist harassment of its workers on the job, which included the hanging of a black driver's effigy from the ceiling of a workplace. And lastly, but not least, is the case of Rob Atkinson, a longtime Teamster activist in Western Pennsylvania, a member of Local 538. He charged the company and his local Teamsters union, led by a woman named Betty Ann Fisher, with colluding with the company to fire him because of his longstanding opposition to concessions and contracts, and him challenging the Hoffa leadership of our union. He is currently has a hearing before the National Labor Relations Board in Pittsburgh, where, among other things, his lawyers subpoenaed the emails from the company and the union, and received over 100 of them, which strongly suggest not only collusion between the company and the local Teamsters union in getting him fired from his job, but also demonstrated very carefully the intense and ongoing surveillance of anybody on the job who attempts to organize against the concessions at UPS and against the local or national leadership of the Teamsters union. This is the reality of life on the job. There are many more examples of this. There's examples of workers committing suicide because of long-standing harassment on the job. There was a case from Alabama of one worker who shot and killed 2 supervisors, then killed himself from a few years ago in Alabama. This is an example of not only what the American workplace has become in the United States, but really how UPS has really pioneered in creating this incredibly oppressive and potentially violent workplace that exists in the country today. And it's taken this model of workplace and tried to take it globally. All this takes place at the same time that UPS announced that in its second quarter, it made $1.2 billion in profit, which means that it's on the road to, once again, probably record profits at the end of this year, and against the background of a international election, mostly the US and Canada and Puerto Rico, for the next leadership of the Teamsters Union, where the reformers are led by Fred Zuckerman, who were challenging the 17-year disastrous leadership of the Teamsters under James Hoffa Jr., son of the, whether you want to call him infamous or famous leader of the Teamsters who disappeared and is presumed dead in 1970 and 1975. So what I want to try to do with the remainder of my time is to kind of take some of these points that I just sort of led off with and try to illustrate them on what this means about the modern industrial economy, where workers have the potential power to regain some of the lost economic power that has so sort of dragged down the American labor movement over the last 3.5 decades, and some ideas about whoever is elected president of the Teamsters come November, the challenges they'll face and what they'll impact in terms of the labor movement as a whole. Because I think if there's one point that I would really like to make is that whatever happens at UPS is going to have an effect throughout the American and global economy, and what the Teamsters do or don't do will have a similar effect as a result of it. Now, when you go through a little bit of the history of UPS, and people can ask me questions about in depth more about different parts of it, if you go to the traditional company history, and some of this is true, it's not really fleshed out very well. UPS begins as a bicycle messenger service in Seattle, Washington in 1907. And so the question you have to sort of ask yourself is how does something begin as a bicycle messenger service, come to be a global behemoth employing 440,000 workers around the road, that delivers to 220 countries each day, mostly by next day air. UPS is one of the largest commercial air fleets in the world. Now, of course, UPS's answer to that is well, determined men can do anything. Well, determined men can also destroy their companies too. So I think the history of UPS also mirrors something about the changes in the global economy and the national economy that will allow a bicycle messenger service to become something different. So what do I mean by that? Well, UPS certainly began as a bicycle messenger service, and for many decades it specialized as a kind of almost boutique delivery service for department stores. So if you went to many major cities on the West Coast, and they made the leap to New York City very early on in their history in the 1930s, UPS did the deliveries for department stores. I got to admit that I was a little confused when I read this history, because after all, if you grow up like I did, or in my family, you just go to the department store, you buy something, and you take it home with you. Why is it necessary to have it delivered by somebody else? Well, in the origins of all of this, it's probably about the glamour of shopping. That, you go, you buy stuff, it's a big experience. And part of the selling idea was that it would be delivered to your home without any burden of you taking care of these items. It would be gift wrapped and delivered by a well-dressed UPS man. And that UPS did very well. I mean, you have to give them credit for doing taking something that was very much a niche market. They developed it, and they turned it into a national business. They did this kind of boutique delivery service from its origins in Seattle right through the early 1950s, where that kind of business completely disappeared. Part of it's due to the development of malls in the suburbs, but mostly it's because widespread ownership of cars. There's no need to have something delivered to your house if you can bring it home in a car. So UPS during the 1950s took its national network of businesses, which was only in a minority of the states. One of the things that people have to remember about how the trucking industry, say if we want to call it that at the time, or the freight industry, is that it was highly regulated by the International Commerce Commission. You had to get not just simply permission to do business in a state, but you had to get permission to kind of even operate in what cities or what parts of what cities or what businesses you did or what type of work. It's a kind of world that's completely disappeared. And UPS, during the course of the 50s, becomes a general freight company. So if you actually look at the business licenses or what was granted to it by the ICC, it becomes a freight company during the course of the 1950s. And slowly but surely specializes in small package delivery, what we used to call, and many people still do call parcel posts, lightweight packages, 10, 15, 20 pounds. And UPS created all these hubs and trucks that primarily specialized in this type of business all over the country. And during the course of the 50s and 60s, it slowly but surely became a 48 contiguous state operation. So by 1976, it can deliver in every state in the United States, and then soon after in Alaska and in Hawaii. It had a reputation and was called by a few business magazines the quiet giant, because unlike today, where you can over the last say 20 or 25 years, you can say things. UPS has these very famous sort of advertising taglines, we're the tightest ship in the shipping business. What can Brown do for you? And things like that. UPS did no advertising, virtually no advertising for the bulk of its history. It was called the quiet giant because part of its business practices was to actually sort of sneak up on its competitors. And it did that very well, so that by 1968, it is actually delivering more packages, more parcel posts than the United States Post Office. Along with this kind of specialized business and becoming a national corporation, UPS also became known for its unique, cult-like, full military culture, a very oppressive workplace to work in. Oz Nelson, who became the CEO of UPS, I've never seen the quote directly from him, but it's always attributed to him, and he's never denied it, is that when he was asked what is the management techniques of UPS, how would you characterize it? He says, well, we're a combination of the Marine Corps and the Quakers. That's a very odd combination, and if you're a Star Trek fan, it sounds more like the Borg, the sinister power that conquers you and absorbs you. There is no resistance, resistance is futile is their slogan. That could easily be UPS's slogan. And if you read one of the very pro-gushy company histories by a man named Greg Neiman called Big Brown, he will talk about how UPS turns out workers better than machines. Now what that really means is that UPS is known for a very authoritarian workplace. It pushes its workers beyond the human limit. It was known and still is known for an extremely high injury rate, and over the years this physical injury rate has also resulted in a lot of stress and mental health issues that impact its workers. The turning point really in the history of UPS in terms of understanding the world of the last 30 years is two things really coming together. The modern logistics revolution and the deregulation of the trucking industry, the airline industry, and the financial industries in this country in the late 70s and the 1980s. UPS was always a big advocate for deregulation. When you go back and you look at the actual political battles over deregulation in the late 70s and the early 1980s. One of the things that strikes you right away is that the established players loved the existing setup. It was sort of a classic example of crony capitalism. They paid off the right senators. Their people basically controlled the regulatory agencies, and they had a very good control over what their particular market was. The outsiders to this this setup, particularly like UPS, were for tearing it all down, because in many ways they rightly thought that they could actually propel themselves forward. Deregulation in a lot of ways was politically driven. It didn't come out of the major players in the industry at the time. Unlike most people, I think, who think that deregulation was simply something of the Republican Party, and certainly they were for this and advocated for it and campaigned for it. The two leading figures in deregulating trucking, the airlines, and finance was Ted Kennedy and Jimmy Carter. And that sort of has gotten lost in history, that it was the liberals who drove deregulation forward. And politically, particularly in the 1970s, the cover for all of that got a lot of public support too, was the fact that the primary economic issue of the 1970s was inflation. And so deregulation was sold to people as a way of combating inflation and produce lower prices and so forth and so on. Well, deregulation may have produced lower prices in the short term, but for some people, it also produced economic disaster for hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of workers, particularly in the trucking company. The Teamsters, which was in 1976, had 2.2 million members. It was simply an enormous union. Right now it has 1.4 million members. It shrunk down to about 1.1 before Ron Carey, the first reform president of the union, was elected in 1991. The Teamsters were literally cut in half by deregulation, and where they had been the strongest in the freight industry, they literally have become a marginal force in it to this very, very day. While all that is taking place, you see what's been called the logistics revolution, which UPS becomes both a beneficiary of and a pioneer of. For most people, logistics has become this kind of advertising buzzword. It's on everything. Everything calls itself a logistics company. Everybody talks about logistics in a way that almost makes it meaningless, but it isn't meaningless. For most people, logistics is still simply understood as old-fashioned warehousing and distribution. That is, somebody makes something, it goes to a warehouse, somebody orders it, it goes to them, and somebody else buys it. And of course, there's an element of that that's still true. But what the logistics revolution has meant overall is a kind of role reversal of things. That in many ways, the rise of UPS is the rise of the retail giant, notably Walmart, but many others, Target, Home Depot, you can name other companies, in which the retail giants come to dominate the supply chains. It's no longer the producers, it's actually the retail giants that dominate it. And what that has meant for companies like UPS, and particularly with the rise of the internet and online shopping, is that they become the nexus between the retail giants and the customers today. The organization of these now supply chains, UPS plays a big role in. It will organize your warehouse, it will organize your distribution, it will organize everything for you. And in a way, what it's done is kind of blurred some of the historic distinctions between manufacturing and distribution. It hasn't ended them, but it's meant that the players are different, and the economy looks different. So companies, the transportation companies, along with the retail companies, now are at the center of the global and at the U.S. economy in a way that they were kind of seen as minor players 50 or 60 years ago. And this has meant that the shift in power and organization has been quite dramatic in terms of, on one hand, decreasing the power of, say, what was the old Teamsters Union, and opening up whole non-union workforces, new industrial workforces. But those workers are not powerless, they just need to be organized. So if you look around, even in a place like Chicago, one of the biggest UPS facilities is a place called the Catch, the Chicago Area Consolidated Hub out in Willow Springs up there. It employs 7,000 people. It's on the grounds of what used to be the old GM Fisher Body plant. It's not an accident that many of the largest UPS or FedEx or distribution hubs like that even that people like Walmart have, are actually located on the old industrial areas because they are in the transportation routes that the economy still runs on. UPS went from employing something like 100,000 Teamsters in 1976 to today employing over 250,000. And that includes the various wings of it, whether it's UPS Freight, the package delivery people, the airlines, or the part-timers who still do the bulk of the work at UPS. They make up 2/3 of the workforce to this very day. One of the reasons I wrote The Package King is because you've seen this very concerted effort. Other people have written about UPS and the teams before. There was a really great pamphlet called How to Beat the Big Brown Machine by Mary Deaton that came out in the late 70s and early 1980s. Dan Labatz wrote about UPS and rank and file rebellion. There's always been, I think, an effort by activists in the labor movement, socialists in the labor movement, who recognized really in the 1970s that UPS represented something different, not only in the trucking industry, but something different in corporate America. So when the concessions binge began in the late 70s and early 80s, UPS took it up with a gusto. And not only destroying many full-time jobs inside the hubs, which had been the predominant jobs, right, and could have still been, and replacing them with part-time workers, they're the ones that also instituted and carried forth on an even greater level multi-tiered or two-tiered and multi-tiered wage structures, so that UPS Teamsters went from making $12 an hour to $8 an hour in 1982, and that stayed at $8 an hour for nearly 30 years afterwards. And if there is a reason why UPS has become, one of the reasons why UPS has become the global corporation it is because of this huge subsidy that concessions that were granted by the Teamsters gave to UPS. Over the last 20 years or so, there has been various efforts to reform the union, to make it represent the workers in the way that it should. Teamsters were a democratic union, began efforts to reform the union in the 1970s. There was a group called Upsurge, which was a wing of TDU, that tried to carry out the struggles at UPS in the late 70s and early 1980s. And all of this really laid the groundwork for the election of Ron Carey as the first reform president of the union in 1991. Carey had this enormously difficult balancing act of both trying to move this lumbering, historically mobbed up, very corrupt, what had been a weakened union, move it forward, and to take on some of the most powerful corporations in the country, most notably UPS, who's also very politically powerful. UPS gives 2/3 of its money to the Republican Party. It donates tens of millions of dollars to politics every election cycle. Sometimes the discussion of dark money hides the fact that the very traditional non-dark money, I guess if you want to call it that, is still what dominates American politics and so forth. The UPS, for example, along with several other major corporations, made a concerted effort to weaken, if not outrightly destroy, OSHA in the 1990s, and they severely weakened it. The most important event, really, of the Carey years was the 1997 UPS strike, when we saw 185,000 workers go on strike across the United States, and they defeated what until then had been, seen as a company that never lost a battle. It galvanized really the labor movement, galvanized a lot of people outside the labor movement who thought we had reached a point now with the labor movement after so many decades of defeat. It's now going to go the other way. Very quickly it unraveled. There's a lot of aspects to why that happened, but Ron Carey was essentially witch hunted out of the union by a Republican-led Congress and a Democratic-controlled Department of Justice who just did not want to have the union run by somebody who was going to challenge corporate America. This is not a unique event in American history. One of the things about the logistics workers today, as transportation workers true in the past, is that they are considered the most potentially powerful and therefore are the most subject to political repression in the country. Eugene Debs very famously led the Pullman strike. It was a Get Debs campaign to put him in jail. The railroad union, for example, live under some of the most repressive labor laws. Harry Bridges led a very important struggle on the waterfront in the West Coast for many years. It was a 20-year campaign to try to get bridges deported from the country, that ultimately his concessions kind of, as people who read the stuff, saved him. Hoffa Sr. Was subject to a decade-long Get Hoffa campaign to try to prevent or to neuter the growing power of the Teamsters Union, and Rod and Kerry got some of the same treatment. All these people are very different as individuals. They're all very different as people. They're all very different as politics. But the one thing that they all represented was organizations of workers that had the potential power to bring the American economy in a halt, and to represented unions that had the potential to fight for their workers. That is, of course, important to keep in mind in terms of any future reform leadership of the Teamsters Union, because they're not going to forget about us. We have to keep remembering what the American government and their corporate allies will do to anybody who tries to turn the Teamsters into a more militant union. And of course, UPS has many political connections that they work in order to make that stuff happen. Just by way of maybe summing up a little bit, UPS is, like I was saying at the beginning, is the largest unionized employer in the country. Of all the logistics giants, it is the most unionized. UPS can become a springboard for organizing FedEx, Amazon. To give an example of how quickly the logistics economy can change, Amazon over the last 3 years has gone on a massive building spree. It today employs nearly 90,000 warehouse workers, and to give you some sense of what that means in terms of union power, the National Master Freight Agreement, which used to cover 400,000 truck drivers in this country and was the jewel in the crown of the Teamsters Union, now represents barely 75,000 people. So there is not only a massive shift in terms of representation, but also the growth of the non-union sector of the logistics economy, and either UPS and UPS workers can play a role in organizing this, because every day 60,000 package car drivers go out and interact with all those workers across the country, or the union beachhead at UPS is going to get smaller and more precarious. A lot of this hinges on what the next leadership of the Teamsters Union will do, and the union is in desperate need of a change in leadership and personnel, and hopefully that will happen. 17 years is enough for James Hoffa Jr., but as we learned from the first Kerry administration, that in itself of turning the union around is a real Herculean task, but the 1997 strike showed that that's something worth fighting for. By way of conclusion, I'll just say that UPS has become very ubiquitous in American life, to the point where you almost don't notice that they're there. And I think that the logistics economy overall is like that. I think if you go out today and walk into any neighborhood, you'll all start seeing Amazon trucks everywhere, FedEx trucks everywhere. You'll even start seeing DHL trucks again more often, just not in the centers of the business centers of the city. These are really what the new industrial economy is in America. These are the workers that have to be organized, and I'm optimistic that that can be done, but the first step in that is a change in the political leadership of the Teamsters Union this fall. So I'll just wrap it up there, and if people have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
I think this is on, yeah. Yeah, great talk, Joe. I want to stay on this theme with regards to looking forward. I mean, we can come back to what's transpired in the past, but just a few quick questions. Is this company public or is it private? That's my first. I'm talking about UPS now.
Well, it was historically private up until 1999 when it went public.
Okay. So it's a publicly stock traded corporation.
Yeah, but most of the stock, I still believe, or at least a large bulk of it, is still owned by UPS managers.
Okay. Because I wasn't aware that it was, even a publicly traded company. My assumption always was that.
Well, they made a big deal.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But anyway, with regards to the TDU, now, from what my limited understanding, I like Peter, I do remember the strike vividly because, you know, we were, I think people that even weren't in the trucking industry at the time, you know, could get behind this, and we saw this as a potentially a way of like awakening, if you will, organized labor and, you know, a more militant, because everybody admired Kerry, of course. But I wonder...
Not everybody.
Well, no, of course, yeah. The
He
people
also
that
had very
actually
powerful
counted
friends.
saw to it that he wasn't going to be around. But the idea, I thought one of the principal issues at that time goes back to this two-tier, we're going to have part-time workers in addition to those employees that are full-time. And obviously, the notion there was that this is a typical ploy in capitalism. You know, we're going to drive down wages, and this is a great way to do it. Every new hire we bring in won't be working full-time, doesn't necessarily have a path to even get there. Where is that? That's my next question. I'm kind of sitting here rambling, but I know where I'm going to go here. The thing is that where is that right now? I mean, relative to, let's go back to the strike at that time, because that was a principal reason, right? If I'm not mistaken, I mean, they were trying to...
It was mostly full-time jobs.
Yeah, and they wanted to ram that down the workers' throats and then change the whole way that the company operated. So how, if anything, subsequently has that changed? And what do you see? I mean, again, moving forward here, I want to stay, you know, in the here and now. What tactically can be done to, you know, to improve this situation? You know, to perhaps, you know, expand membership. I know they want to do things like that as well. But I guess what I'm asking is, in a way, is just where is this in terms of political consciousness on the part of the union itself, the union leadership, TDU in particular, because I assume that they're way out in front on this relative to the kind of decrepit leadership that they've been saddled with all these years. I'll let you take it from there.
Well, there's several things. One is that the issue of full-time jobs out of part-time positions is still a major issue at UPS. The last several contracts nationally negotiated by COFA have created very few full-time jobs. As a result, the workforce continues to grow, but the actual proportion of full-time jobs for part-timers has actually declined, or stagnant to decline. The issue of part-time pay, of course, is still horrendous. I mean, for 30 years it was at roughly $8 an hour. It's only gone up to about 10. UPS, in some ways, I mean, some people disagree with me about this, but in some ways, the campaign that led to the 1997 strike, I mean, because the slogan of the strike was "Part-time America Won't Work," and it was a very popular strike. I remember one very humorous moment where James Kelly, who was the CEO at the time, was being interviewed on one of the business networks. It might have been CNN, but I just can't remember. And he was asked, "Well, why is the strike so popular, Mr. Kelly?" And he sort of mused for a moment and said, "Well, I guess if you put up a powerful multinational corporation against a hard-working UPS driver, I guess I would support him too." So that was a little bit of a lapse there on Jim's part, but I think that really did capture things. I think the other thing about the popularity of the strike was that it after the 1990s, where, and this has only gotten worse since then, is that workers just feeling like they're in this permanently precarious work situation where not only is access to getting a full-time job difficult to get, but one with benefits, one with some future, one with some sense that if you get it, it will improve in terms of benefits. All of that, and a pension. Here we are 20 years later, and it's even in a worse situation overall. And I think at the time, 20 years ago, when we were after the 80s, it was bad enough. When we were into the 90s, it seemed worse. And so the strike tapped into that, and that's one of the reasons why it was so popular. I think for today, I think that the situation is even more difficult, particularly when it comes to issues like pensions. The Central States Pension Fund, which became, notorious for being kind of the mob piggy bank in the 60s and 70s. You can just watch the movie Casino, and it illustrates very well how it was looted by the mob and the big casinos to build them, and what that has meant to today is that it totters on the edge of bankruptcy. Nearly over 400,000 retired Teamsters are facing anywhere from a 50 to a 70% cut in their monthly pension benefits in the near future, which really raises the question of why do you even work for a living if there's nothing at the end of the day there for you. That's one of the big indictments of Hoffett's leadership, that during this 17-year tenure, there has been nothing done to protect what was the most important pension fund in the country, and now several other Teamster pensions are in equally precarious situations. And if there's one thing union members expect, because they have a very low bar in respect for most of their leadership, is that they at least expect the leaders to take care of the pension. And when that's not even there, then it raises the question of why is this person in the leadership of the union. UPS, I think, is in desperate need for the next contract, which is in 2018. I think that, one, it would benefit greatly for taking what has been the Fight for 15 campaign outside of UPS and bringing it inside of UPS. Because in many ways, I think the Part-Time America Won't Work campaign in 96 and 97 is in a way one of the parents of today's Fight for 15 campaign. In a way it is. I mean, I really believe that. Some people disagree with me, but I really believe that. It may not be a straight shot, but I think that's what put that on the agenda and showed that it would be a popular thing to organize around. I think that needs to be brought back into UPS. Wages are just too damn low for the type of work that you do and the type of wealth that's extracted from you. UPS is rich because its workers are poor. And that's a simple equation. I think also there needs to be a renewed full-time jobs campaign at UPS. And there needs to be something done to protect the pensions for retired workers. We may have reached the point where things like the Central States Pension Fund, which UPS is not part of, UPS pulled out of it essentially with the cooperation of the Hoffett administration about 7 or 8 years ago. That's one of the contributing factors to it becoming in the precarious state that it is. This isn't the only one, but it's one of the major ones. And there may be the only solution to that is a political solution in Washington. I don't know if there is a contract solution to that particular problem with the Central States Pension Fund. But I think that, when you look at what can be done at UPS, is that you take the Fight for 15, a renewed campaign for full-time jobs, and then you use that as a way of going into the non-union wings of the logistics industry. Ron Carey said it long ago, but it was absolutely true. You cannot organize new members if you're selling out your old. It's a very simple point of trade unionism. But I think that is one of the things that particularly UPS illustrates very clearly.
Thanks, Joe. People who are familiar with my comments know that I don't have a question. I'm aware that I'm not the speaker, but I'm going to lecture anyway. I've read that there's a quote-unquote new paradigm for production work, not just in this country, but worldwide, a new corporate paradigm, where you run the production line not at a human pace and not at a fast pace, and not as quickly as humanly possible, but you run that production line more quickly than humanly possible. You run it as quickly as materially possible. And the reason you do this is, of course, in their terms, to make production more efficient. And if you run it at the fastest materially possible pace, and parts of it break down, then you've identified the weakest parts of the production line so that you can, quote unquote, shore them up And this is, of course, speed up by another name, but it's speed up to the 10th power on steroids. And not only is this the worldwide corporate model, but it's bled over into a model for the service industry. That the service industry that is not production, not industrial production, should be run the same way, and that every materially possible rate should be raised in order to make more efficient, quote unquote, the production. Could you comment on your experience of this, what it's meant at UPS, what it's meant for the humans involved in this?
Right.
Thank you.
Speaking on behalf of the humans, one of the things that, well, I'll start with the big picture and then I'll talk about my own experience. One of the things is that when you talk to some of the older UPSers, older Teamsters, who are, well into their 60s now, maybe many of who are retired, and who were hired as full-timers, either in hub workers or particularly drivers, say in the late 60s or early 70s, is that they will tell you that there was a noticeable change during the course of the 70s. Now, sometimes I always wonder if it's a little bit of, not faulty memory, like the old days were better, but they'll tell you that something changed during the course of the 70s. And I think they're right on that. I don't think UPS was great before 1970 in terms of its treatment of workers, its cult-like atmosphere, and its pusher mentality, but certainly during the course of the 70s, something does change. And you know that because this happens in all the major manufacturing and transportation companies across the globe, is that there is a greater push for productivity. One of the things that the global economic crisis in 1973 did is it highlighted the low profitability of the corporations, and part of the solution to that was to push workers harder. So like if you interview a lot of the older UPSers, they'll talk about, and Dan Labatz does this a lot in his book, Rank and File Rebellion, is they'll talk about how the pusher mentality really gets going in the 1970s with supervisors. Push, push, push. You don't shut off the belt, particularly if you're working in the hubs. The belts that crisscross all of the UPS hubs, bringing tens of thousands of packages across the buildings into their particular trucks for delivery, or into feeder trucks, which is what UPS calls it, semi-trucks, to go to other parts of the country, is that the belts don't get shut off, right? You don't. And this is the UPS version of the speed up, which any assembly line worker will recognize in the auto industry. In the 1970s, Upsurge had a newspaper called Upsurge. It was widely distributed, and it's always good to have, when you have a newspaper and you have a national presence, sympathizers in management will slip you stuff that they don't like, because they don't want to do this stuff, right? I mean, you go into management because you don't want to be a worker anymore, but you don't necessarily go into management to become a total bastard either, right? And one of the documents that they got, an internal document that was being used to train UPS supervisors, was one called How to Fire a Worker for Low Productivity. So we know that something changed during the course of the 1970s from their own documents. You push, 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 which is why work became more dangerous at UPS during the course of the 1970s, in the 1980s and 1990s. So in the 1990s, it is one of the worst OSHA violators in the United States. Permanent ergonomic injuries, hands, shoulders, but also deaths on the job as a result of the unsafe working conditions, which is why they also, along with their other allies in meat packing and other manufacturing corporations, put so much money into trying to neuter, if not destroy, UPS during the 1990s. It was also one of the things that Kerry, when he took over the union, had to try to counter in Washington, because one of the things that the reformers then, which if there's a change in leadership this fall, hopefully there will be, but I can't make predictions about that. You have to wait for the ballots to be counted. Is that this will also be one of the things that has to come to terms with, is that you have to fight them in the workplace, you have to fight them with national contracts, and you have to fight their political power in Washington. Right? It's a multi-front battle that has to take place. And what this means, particularly when I worked at UPS, is that you never work so hard for so little money. When I first worked at UPS in 1984 in Watertown, Mass, which you probably, if you were from Boston, you would properly pronounce it Watertown, is that I got hired almost on a lark to work there. My job came to an end. I was painting houses in the summer. I like painting houses. I learned it from my dad. And I called up UPS to see if they, when they had shifts, and they said, well, come on in. And those are the days when you could get a real person on the phone. And I went in, I filled out a form, you want to work tonight? So I went in and I worked that night. And my training consisted of, I think it was 20 minutes of kind of some show and tell. And my supervisor said to me, just don't bury the rollers, because you're just going to be a loader tonight. You just load all these. And it was this maddening pace. It was very easy to get hurt. And I remember when break time came, we'd all make this mad dash for the candy machine or whatever. And I saw a whole group of guys heading for the gate, the exit gate, the guard shack. And I asked one of the older guys that I was working with, a guy named Vinny, I said, where are they going? He says, oh, they're quitting. And I said, what do you mean? He says, oh, that happens with every new crew that comes in. Half the shift leaves before at break time. And he says, well, you're going to be okay. Now that's always a question of, are you okay to stay or okay to leave? Somebody made a better judgment. Whatever you think about it is that right from the very beginning, you had a sense of a very difficult place to work. Now, I'm not afraid of hard work, but what I'm opposed to is hard work without very much reward. Because making $8 an hour for working 3.5 or 4 hours a night, like I did in those days, you look at your paycheck at the end of the week, and you're making huge amounts of cash for your employer, and you're taking home very little. And it was like that for 30 years. And when all the people who I know who were drivers and still are drivers at UPS, I've never seen a group of people who hustle, work hard, and are treated so badly. If I can, I'll read you something from, that's an example of, how, drivers who UPS, like when I said UPS workers are poor, and that makes UPS rich, I'm predominantly referring to the part-timers, because UPS will come out and say, look at our drivers, they're very well paid, blah, 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 what are you talking about? And I'll say, well, yeah, but they may be well paid, but they shouldn't be treated like this. This is a quote from my book. In 1992, the Great Lakes Center for Occupational and Environmental Safety and Health, affiliated with the University of Illinois, conducted a nationwide study involving 317 package car drivers at a, quote, unnamed delivery company. It was pretty clearly UPS. Among the sources of stress for drivers, he reported this, quote, the drivers complain of a punitive attitude from frontline supervisors, daily supervisory pressure to work more hours and through lunch, stressful supervisory pressure in the trucks on their route, and pressure on replacement drivers to outperform those on sick leave and vacation. They reported conflicting expectations emanating from differing supervisors and a disciplinary system in which they were judged guilty and sentenced before trial. Finally, drivers reported a stressful social environment at work fostered by a perceived lack of social support from supervisory personnel. And the study concluded, this study suggested job stress is a psychological health hazard for these drivers. 20 years later, it's worse. I think that, but this is not something that's peculiar to UPS. This is the American workplace today. UPS has pioneered this workplace. It's not the only one guilty of it. Maybe there are even people, workplaces where workers, certainly if they're non-union, like at Amazon, they get the worst of both worlds. They make not very good money, and they have all the worst pressure and discipline on the job, and are considered just disposable workers. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
I'm usually not jumping right back in here, but I have to make a comment. This is something that occurred in my circumstances in the last month. I had a situation where I had a stove failed. The thing is just not baking anything anymore. So long story short, I called up a major, who remain, unidentified, a major national retailer in order to get a replacement.
Right.
And no problem, in fact, I got a call almost immediately right back when I had already selected, see, the guy told me this weekend, over the telephone. I'm actually talking to somebody. And you got a deal, okay, we can deliver it tomorrow. I'm like, okay, that's fine. Will you be available? Gave me this 2-hour, window. And I said, yeah, just have them give me a call so I can look out the window, see they're there. And they went 3 stories up, And this thing weighs a few pounds. I mean, huge, right? Okay, long story short is, here's the next day, and, like in that window, I get the phone call, I look outside, and I see, first of all, a large rental truck. Very clearly, not some corporate, whatever. So I'm thinking, right immediately in my mind, it's like, well, these guys are obviously, paid to do. They're not employees of this major retailer. They're just precarious employment situation. And I see the guys open up the back, and there's it's already out of the crate. They had it out of the crate on the back, and there was no lift on the back. So I see there are 2 of them, goes and gets the dolly out, and the thing had straps on it and whatnot. So the 2 of them had to engineer this off the back of the truck, and we're talking about, here's the base, the floor is about 3.5 feet up. That was not an easy thing to do. I mean, it was ungodly. I mean, watch them trying to maneuver this thing. So they get up in there, and I asked the guy, I said, pardon me, but do you mind if I ask? I said, first of all, you're not an employee of blah, 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 right? No, I says, we just, we work on when they call us, so we got a bunch of stuff on the truck. We're working today, right? How much are you making? The guy said, $9 an hour. I'm like, well, And now these guys are also, because it is a stove, it's a gas range, they hook that up too. They better know what they're doing. Because, I don't want to die tomorrow morning or blow to bits because the gas is, but I mean, they actually did the job. I said, I don't know how you can possibly operate. You have the responsibility to rent the truck too. It's not even your own, they had to pay for that, I gave the guy a $25 tip. And I said, I hope that people are giving you something besides, and he said, well, yeah, not always. So this just points out, I think, where a whole lot of, individuals are at that are out there. No union, no, working for nothing, basically. I mean, how does one, it's outrageous. I mean, it's really, this is something that I think a lot of people don't really give a thought to, but it's almost, I mean, it's criminal. I mean, that somebody would have to be put through a situation like that in order to try to survive, because that's all it is, at best. But anyway, I'll just leave that thought there if you want to expand on that or talk about it. Go ahead.
Well, what you see, particularly with Amazon, is that Amazon has now gone from being a contractor of what they would call third-party, delivery companies, to now being a delivery company. What's interesting is that it now it's building an air fleet for overnight deliveries. In fact, it had this big press conference, was it 2 weeks ago, where they had Prime One flew from New York to Seattle and had their, big press conference to talk about their overnight flights. Their air fleet is predominantly rented from Atlas and a few other major air cargo operations, and they're based in Wilmington, Ohio, which is where Airborne/DHL used to be based. So they've taken over essentially what was the old airport for DHL. DHL is now based in Cincinnati and northern Kentucky for their air operations. And if you look at the map, you have Louisville, you have Memphis, which are right on the Mississippi River. You have Wilmington, Ohio, Cincinnati, northern Kentucky, and that makes up what the inside industry people call Cargo Alley, because you can fly literally anywhere in the continental United States within 3 hours from there, which allows you to do overnight delivery. Amazon has not just simply built warehouses, what they call fulfillment centers. See, every major logistics company has its own sort of cult-like language, you know, semi-trucks or feeder trucks. UPS's warehouses and distribution centers are called hubs. Amazon calls them fulfillment centers. And they've become quite ubiquitous. If you drive up, you know, Route 94 through Kenosha, they have a massive facility there. They've built Amazon's built two fulfillment centers in Joliet at a massive logistics park there, the old Joliet Arsenal. They have their delivery operations are based here in Chicago at 28th and Western Avenue and on Goose Island. They're probably and in Lyle, so they've set this up where they have people who work for Amazon and people who are contractors who also work for Amazon. And you know, hopefully some of the recent Supreme Court and mostly NLRB rulings about working for contractors and who's the real employer could possibly benefit organizing these places. What you need is the political will to do it. I mean, there's been people who have been trying to do some organizing in these vast non-union areas of the country, like the Warehouse Workers for Justice, which is a project of you know the UE, and so forth. But these are hardworking and good people, but it doesn't make up for what is really needed to organize these powerful, large corporations, which is to be met by an equally powerful union and well-financed organizing campaign, which may not succeed the first time around. I mean, when you think about organizing some of the big industrial conglomerates, you know, which transformed the American labor movement, whether it's companies like U.S. Steel or Ford or General Motors, they weren't defeated on the first battle, right? I mean, it took, you know, if you go from, you know, the defeat of 1919 at the steel strike, which was, you know, predominantly based from Pittsburgh to Chicago, to their capitulation to the CIO, that was nearly 20 years. Ford, you know, weathered the organizing of the auto industry until 1941, where it was also a lot of pressure from the federal government to make concessions to the labor movement for war production. So, you know, we have a labor movement that has many talented people in it, but unions themselves that have been on the decline for a very long time, and in trying to turn this around, it's not going to be the first time up at bat that we're going to succeed. In fact, we have to think about creating a new generation of organizers. Now, I think those people are out there. If you look at anything from the people who've been through Fight for 15, the new Black Lives Matter movement, the Occupy movement, many of the people who went through the Bernie campaign, these are young people who have lived through what is the reality of the American workplace today. These are the people who would become the new cadre for a new labor movement in this country. The question is who can organize it both politically and in the unions.
Hi, I'm Rita Flynn, and I own a small business, so I have both sides of the story, and my comments may not be politically correct, forgive me. As a small business owner, my corporation has made arrangements with UPS to deliver the products to my door at a reasonable cost. It's not low, it's not cheap,
No.
but it's a reasonable cost considering the distance it's traveling and the speed at which they deliver. So I'm very happy with UPS in that respect. However, when I go to send packages to my customers, which is almost daily, I spend a great deal of money, and I find that USPS is far, far cheaper and faster than UPS. UPS charges a great deal of money and does not deliver to 25% of the homes at the small end. How do I say it? 25% of those local deliveries are not made by UPS. They're pushed off onto USPS. And I don't know how that...
That's called SurePost.
Yeah, I don't know how that works. But I do know that some of my customers now also have to go to a center to pick up their products. And that's very annoying for them because they work 8-hour jobs as well. They're not just unemployed, they've got to now go to a special place to pick up their stuff. Sometimes they don't know where they're going. The other thing that I wanted to mention about UPS, I think that drivers in Chicago anyway are extremely patient with UPS drivers. They're just like the beer trucks. They park right in the middle of the street. They expect you to go around or take another block. And everybody does. Nobody complains, nobody honks their horn. We're very respectful. And I was thinking about why that might be, and I think the corporate owners are very smart in dressing them in a uniform, because that uniform gives them a little authority. And so for what it's worth, maybe it's a good business ploy, I don't know. But it kind of irritates me that they're like a beer truck and you have to go 5 blocks around. That's it. Thank you.
Well, the uniforms are about conformity and a kind of what I refer to as this kind of faux military discipline that exists at UPS from the very beginning. When the New Yorker did a profile of James Casey way back when, they did 2 of them, one in the 30s and one in the 40s, is they referred to UPS as having all these rules that the drivers had to follow about grooming, and you treat adult men like they're children. That's really what it's about. It's pretty obnoxious most of the time. And they refer to UPS as being like a Tibetan monastery because they had so many rules. Now this was, 70 years ago they said this, and it's far progressed this way. And what you see with UPS, the point about what they deliver and how they do it, when you go and hear them speak before Congress or in the propaganda that they put out or FedEx puts out, is they all seem like they're these fierce competitors with one another, UPS, FedEx, and the post office. And what you find out really is that there's actually quite a lot of cooperation that goes on between them. They have a pretty interesting menage a trois going on because UPS and FedEx, they want to cherry pick, as any profit-making business does. They want to cherry pick what they want to do. So one of the things that they don't want to do, for example, is go to every address in the United States every day, and neither does FedEx. So they have these deals with the post office. One's called SurePost, and FedEx is called SmartPost. And what these do is that they give, UPS gives the post office, and FedEx gives the post office thousands, tens of thousands, of packages each day that are to be delivered by the post office, because the post office actually has to go to every address every day in America, and they don't want to. So they want to dump what they perceive as the least profitable or the items that they don't want to make a second attempt on. That's why they've created these sort of access points, because they make money off of delivering it the first time. They don't make money delivering off it the second time. Now, you can't cry for these guys too much, because they made $5 billion in profit last year. So they're not really hurting. This is about maximizing profit, not making a profit, all right? So let's keep that in mind. FedEx, there's also, this is about political power and how they use it to cherry pick also. So, for example, the U.S. Post Office is not allowed to own airplanes in order to fly its own mail or packages. So every few years, I don't think it's each year, but every few years, there's a battle about who will fly the U.S. mail. And so last year and for many years, FedEx wins that contract, and it's worth about $10.6 billion to fly the mail's stuff. So on one hand, you have to say, they on one hand talk about what fierce competitors they are at one another. On the other hand, there's also a degree of cooperation that goes on amongst them. Some people say that they want UPS to get out of residential delivery. That's not quite right. It's about cherry picking deliveries so that you're always maximizing the most profit, because online shopping continues to grow and will continue to grow and has become a permanent part of the way that Americans buy goods in this country. And that means that companies like UPS are going to continue to expand on the basis of online shopping, and they're not going to give it up. They just, like FedEx and like the post office, they're going to try to figure out how to do this. Bloomberg News once described the post office as an extension of Amazon, because the post office gives Amazon this enormous discount to deliver their packages, and they deliver millions of packages for Amazon every day, because they're going to have the same strategy or issues or dilemmas as they deliver more and more of their own stuff, because they don't want to go to every address in America every day. So they'll always keep the post office, at least I believe so, for that stuff that the UPS and the Postal and FedEx wants to do, while at the same time focusing on what is the most profitable. Now, for workers in a place like UPS, now UPS will give away thousands of packages for SurePost and then lay off drivers that morning. So for unionized workers at UPS, the issue of SurePost is a big one because it's about work producing layoffs of drivers every day across this country, and I'm sure will be a major issue in the 2018 contract. Anything else?
Okay, is that all? Any other questions? All right, thank you very much, Joe.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you, everybody. If you'd like to get a copy of the package came.